59% of the American population, according to Gallup, that Jesus will return to earth to judge us. This entails claims about the human survival of death, apparently the human flight without the aid of technology. I mean, this is what people are visualizing.
Do you think, I'm curious, do you think that the idea of human survival of death is an anti-scientific claim?
Well, in the naive form that most people entertain it clearly is. Now,
they don't think that their body doesn't disintegrate. They assume that it does disintegrate. What they assume is that there is something inside of you that is eternal, which I assume as well.
And
it doesn't seem to me anti-scientific.
Well, it's anti-scientific if you believe that you have good evidence for that. I mean, this is what's anti-scientific. When your certainty, when your convictions don't scale with your evidence. I mean, I'm actually open-minded on the survival of death. I don't know.
You say about reincarnation, that there could even be evidence for it in your book.
Yes, I mean, I can easily tell you what would constitute evidence. I'm not saying this evidence exists, but I mean, I can tell you what would constitute evidence for the truth of Mormonism. It's just not forthcoming.
We're not going to get political on this.
I mean, there are all kinds of scientific things you can say about religion, which religious people tend not to want to hear. I mean, you can say, for instance, that Mormonism is objectively less likely to be true than Christianity. And why can you say this? Because Mormonism is just Christianity plus some rather stupid ideas.
When talking about morality, we value differences of opinion in a way that we don't in any other area of our lives. So, for instance, the Dalai Lama gets up every morning meditating on compassion, and he thinks that helping other human beings is an integral component of human happiness. Okay. On the other hand, we have someone like Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was very fond of abducting and raping and torturing and killing young women. Okay, so we appear to have a genuine difference of opinion about how to profitably use one's time. Okay. Most Western intellectuals look at this situation and say, well, there's nothing for the Dalai Lama to be really right about, or for Ted Bundy to be really wrong about, that admits of a real argument that potentially falls within the purview of science. Okay, that he likes chocolate, he likes vanilla. There's nothing that one should be able to say to the other that should persuade the other. Now notice that we don't do this in science. On the left you have Edward Witten. He's a string theorist. If you ask the smartest physicists around, who's the smartest physicist around, in my experience, half of them will say Ed Witten. The other half will tell you they don't like the question. So, what would happen if I showed up at a physics conference and said string theory is bogus? You know, it doesn't resonate with me, it's not how I choose to view the universe at the smallest scale, I'm not a fan. Okay, well, nothing would happen because I'm not a physicist. I don't understand string theory. I'm the Ted Bundy of string theory. Okay? I wouldn't want to belong to any string theory club that would have me as a member. Okay? But this is just the point. Okay? Whenever we are talking about facts, certain opinions must be excluded. That is what it is to have a domain of expertise. That is what it is for knowledge to count. How have we convinced ourselves that in the moral sphere there is no such thing as moral expertise, or moral talent, or moral genius even? How have we convinced ourselves that every opinion has to count? How have we convinced ourselves that every culture has a point of view on these subjects worth considering? Does the Taliban have a point of view on physics that is worth considering? No. Okay. How is their ignorance? How is their ignorance any less obvious on the subject of human well-being? So this, I think, is what the world needs now. It needs people like ourselves to admit that there are right and wrong answers to questions of human flourishing. And morality relates to that domain of facts. It is possible for individuals, and even for whole cultures, to care about the wrong things. Which is to say, it's possible for them to have beliefs and desires that reliably lead to needless human suffering. Just admitting this will transform our discourse about morality. Okay, we live in a world in which the boundaries between nations mean less and less, and they will one day mean nothing. We live in a world filled with destructive technology, and this technology cannot be uninvented. It will always be easier to break things than to fix them. Okay, it seems to me, therefore, patently obvious that we can no more respect and tolerate vast differences in notions of human well-being than we can respect or tolerate vast differences in the notions about how disease spreads, or in the safety standards of buildings and airplanes. We simply must converge on the answers we give to the most important questions in human life. And to do that, we have to admit that these questions have answers. Thank you very much.
Now, while man was made in the image of God, woman was made in the image of man, according to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Her humanity, therefore, is derivative. It's ersatz. The Old Testament values the life of a woman at 1/2 to 2/3 that of a man. The Quran says that the testimony of 2 women is required to offset the testimony of 1 man. And every woman is deserving of 1/2 her brother's share of inheritance. But the biblical God has made it perfectly clear that women are expected to live in absolute subjugation to their fathers until the moment they are pressed into connubial service to their husbands. And the New Testament offers no relief. I mean, St. Paul put it in his letter to the Ephesians, "Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. As the church is subject to Christ, so let wives be subject to their husbands in all things." The Quran delivers the same message. And on most translations, says that disobedient wives should be whipped or scourged or beaten. The 11th century sage, Al-Ghazali, perhaps the most influential Muslim since Muhammad, described a woman's duties this way. She should stay at home and get on with her spinning. She should not go out often. She must not be well informed, nor must she be communicative with her neighbors, and only visit them when absolutely necessary. She should take care of her husband and respect him in his presence and in his absence, and seek to satisfy him in everything. She must not leave the house without his permission, and if given his permission, she must leave surreptitiously. She should put on old clothes and take the deserted streets and alleys, avoid markets, make sure that a stranger does not hear her voice or recognize her. She must not speak to a friend of her husband's even in need. Her sole worry should be her virtue, her home as well as her prayers and her fast. If a friend of her husband calls when the latter is absent, she must not open the door nor reply to him in order to safeguard her and her husband's honor. She should accept what her husband gives her as sufficient sexual needs at any moment. She should be clean and ready to satisfy her husband's sexual needs at any moment. Now recall the blissful lives of women in Afghanistan under the Taliban, or think about the millions of women who even now are forced to wear the veil under Islam, or who are forced into these forced marriages with men they have never met. And you will realize that these kinds of religious opinions have consequences. The net effect of religion, especially in the Abrahamic tradition, has been to demonize female sexuality and portray women as morally and intellectually inferior to men. I mean, every woman, it is imagined, holds the honor of the men in her lives for ransom, and is liable to tarnish it with a glance, or destroy it outright through sexual indiscretion. In this context, rape is actually a crime that one man commits against another man. The woman is only shame's vehicle, and often culpably acquiescent, being all blandishments and guile and winking treachery. In the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 22, God says that if a woman doesn't scream loudly enough while being raped, she should be stoned to death as an accessory to her own defilement. There's no escaping the view in the Bible and the Quran that women have been put on earth to serve men, to keep their homes in order, and to be incubators of sons. So I think this is a fact that really cannot be disputed. If we ever achieve a global civilization that truly values
and honors the rights and capabilities of women, it will not be because we paid more attention to our holy books.
Okay, there are a few claims there that we have to shelve. One is this idea that you just claim that I got my morality from a religious tradition. Ask yourself, when you pick up the Bible or the Hebrew Bible or any holy book and find ethical wisdom in there, what is that process like? I mean, you pick up Leviticus or Deuteronomy, and you find that if a woman is not a virgin on her wedding night, you're supposed to stone her to death on her father's doorstep. Okay, presumably you choose to reject that pearl of ancient wisdom. And then you find another line, I think this is also in Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. Or the golden rule, as preached in the New Testament. And this resonates with you as a good operating premise to generate further moral intuitions. If nothing else, it's a good ideal to live toward. Now, that process, the guarantor of your morality in that case is not the book. It's in your brain. And this kind of truth testing is something that we bring to religion. Now, religion does a lot of work on people, and you can get good people to believe some very terrible things in the name of God, and this is what worries me about religion. And I think we waste time talking about Stalin and Hitler and Pol Pot, frankly, because these were political religions. These were dogmatisms through and through, and when anyone started to make too much sense in opposition to these dogmatisms, they were carted off and killed. These were not contexts in which rational discourse prevailed and the best idea won. So to call them science is just to misuse the term. And it's, in the case of Hitler, it's just a total non sequitur, because Hitler never really repudiated Jesus, and he used Jesus in his speech, and he was facilitated by 1,000 years of religious fulminating against the Jews in the name of Christianity. Religion is implicated, certainly, in the Holocaust. So it's not, I think, a conversation worth having. The second reason to be attentive to the differences among religions is that these differences are actually a matter of life and death. And that there are very few of us who lie awake at night worrying about the Amish. This is not an accident. While I'm convinced that the Amish are mistreating their children by not educating them adequately, they are not likely to hijack aircraft and fly them into buildings. Consider how we as atheists are constrained to talk about Islam. And Christians often complain that atheists balance, and the secular media generally, balance every discussion of Islam with a discussion of extremist Christianity. The usual mode is to say, well, they have their jihadists, but we have people who kill abortion doctors. Okay, I think our Christian neighbors, even the craziest of them, are right to be outraged by this pretense of even-handedness. The truth is that Islam is quite a bit scarier and more culpable for needless human misery at this moment than Christianity has been for a very, very long time. And we have to point this out. You might remember that Thomas Friedman recently wrote an op-ed from Iraq noticing that some Sunni militias were fighting alongside American troops against al-Qaeda, and he asked a Sunni militant why he was doing this, and the militant said that he had recently seen an al-Qaeda member decapitate an 8-year-old girl, and this convinced him that the American Crusader forces were the lesser of two evils. Now, okay, great. So even Muslims, even Sunni militants, can discern the line between ordinary crazy Islam and the utterly crazy once it is drawn in the spilled blood of little girls. This is a basis for hope of sorts. We have to be clear, unremittingly clear about what is on the other side of that line. This is what we and the rest of the civilized world and the semi-civilized world are facing: utter religious lunacy and barbarism in the name of Islam, with, I'm unhappy to say, some mainstream theology to back it up. To be even-handed as we are constrained to be as atheists, when discussing the problem of Islam, is to misconstrue the problem. The refrain that all religions have their extremists is bullshit. All religions don't have these extremists. Some religions have never had these extremists. A recent poll in the UK showed that a third of young British Muslims say they want to live under Sharia law and think that anyone who leaves the faith should be put to death for apostasy. This is a third of British Muslims. 68% of British Muslims think that their neighbors who insult Islam should be arrested and prosecuted. 78% think that the Danish cartoonist should be brought to justice. These people do not have a clue about what constitutes a civil society. It seems to me that reports like this coming out of Muslim communities living in the West should concern us before anything else about religion concerns us.
Is that okay with you, or?
No, well, it's ironic that I never thought of myself as an atheist before I wrote The End of Faith. I never even was made aware of the atheist foundations in this country and the atheist think tanks. And as I argue in Letter to a Christian Nation, I don't think atheism is a term we need, and it's not a name that anyone really needs to answer to.
Well, what does it mean to you exactly? Is it somebody who's sure there's no God, or? No.
It's somebody, in the same way that somebody's sure that there's no Zeus, you can be sure that there's no God of Abraham. It's not the kind of certainty that says we have proved the absence of this thing. Yeah. It's just that there's no good reason to believe in this thing. And so the reason why I object to the term atheism is that we don't have terms for people who don't accept astrology, for instance. You don't have to wake up in the morning and define yourself around this variable, I'm not an astrologer, and you don't join a club for non-astrologers. You just use reason and evidence and common sense. I mean, these are the only terms I think you need, or the only schemas you need to resist the claims of astrology. And so when an astrologer comes forward and says this isn't an exact science, you ask for evidence, and when the evidence is not forthcoming, you dismiss these claims. And I think we can do the same with theistic religion.
Okay. So strictly speaking, it's kind of the same as agnosticism as it's commonly understood, in that you're not completely sure of the absence of any God.
Well, it's not agnosticism in the sense, I think Bertrand Russell clarified this with his famous teapot argument. Can you prove that there's a China teapot in orbit around the sun? No. Or can you disprove the existence of this teapot? No. Well, then is it reasonable to be an agnostic about this teapot? Well, not really, because there's just no good reason to believe that there would be a teapot in orbit around the sun. So it's basically that.
First of all, this is why fundamentalism always has an edge over more sophisticated theology, because the sophisticated theology is, in most cases, inspired by a more and more modern recognition that, well, we can't read it literally because it either makes no sense or it makes barbaric sense, right? So we have to get away from the literal. And the more you get away from the literal, the more you are unconstrained by the text, and you can just broadcast on it anything you want to put there. And so, the literal, there's no question that most generations of Christians who read Revelation expected the world to end in some literal sense of this kind of phantasmagoria. I mean, there was going to be a beast, and it was, undoubtedly they thought this was going to happen in their own time, under Rome, but this is if you're going to go purely literary on any of these texts, on some level you're playing tennis without the net. You're unconstrained by the text, and you can do with it more or less anything you want.
But isn't that argument working at cross purposes with your other argument about dogma?
Because it's always tempting. First of all, there are lines that do not announce that they're susceptible to that interpretation. I mean, yes, you can say, listen, Allah does not want us to cut the hands off of thieves. He just, he meant cut the hand of their volition rather than their actual hands, right? So you're constraining them rather than cutting. Now, sure, undoubtedly there was some Muslim somewhere who wants to interpret it that way, but it gets harder and harder the clearer the line is. And the problem with all of these texts is that there are so many principles. Again, I mean, so to read Revelation any way you want, it is still a problem that it is perfectly rational on the basis of reading that text to expect the world to end and for Jesus to be the only savior of it. Therefore, if you happen to be born a Hindu or born a Muslim or born a Jew who doesn't recognize Jesus to be the Messiah, you are screwed for all eternity.
The place to put our faith is in human conversation. This is all we have to work with. And the choice is to have a truly modern 21st century conversation, availing ourselves of all of the tools and all of the wealth of human effort that is our legacy. Or we can fixate our conversation in a prior century. It can be the 7th century if you're a Muslim. It can be the 5th century BC if you're a Jew. And we can privilege a conversation that was had then among people who could barely see the wisdom of swapping out their child for a goat in a sacrifice. And dignify their claims to understanding reality with some kind of special prescience. And I think we should be very leery of doing that, given what we see about us in the name of religion.
Thank you.